Diablo 4's Vessel of Hatred expansion is just around the corner, and I was given the opportunity to play the pre-release of the SpiritBorn class, and of course I made it my quest to come up with the best poison build we could possibly imagine, and that's what I am to show you in this video. So without further ado, I bring you the PoisonBurn SpiritBorn. Now, as always, a few quick caveats before we get started here. There could be some changes from the pre-release into launch, so do stay tuned. There is a written guide down below. It will be a max roll D4 planner. I am not affiliated with max roll, and I will keep that up to date regardless of whatever happens with the SpiritBorn. So do keep that up regardless of what time you are watching this video. That thing will be up to date. This thing is crazy. It's crazy fast. The mobility is insane. I'm going to show you some gameplay. This thing plows through Torment 4. Helltide's probably the greatest Helltide build of all time. You are just flying across the screen, killing everything in sight, gathering just nutty amounts of shards. This thing absolutely shreds nightmare dungeons. You're going to be getting that Obdusite like crazy for masterworking. And of course, most importantly, this thing will shred high level pits. In the gameplay, I'm going to try to weave in and out of me talking in this video. It is a pit level 80, which, if you guys don't know, is the new pit level 100 from the PTR. They recently did sort of an overall nerf to the game. Basically, everything that was farmable in pit level 100 is now like pit level 80. So if you're really struggling on PTR to hit level 80, well, you're going to be really struggling just to get into Torment 4. So this thing, basically speed farming a pit tier 80, is absolutely nutty. My gear is masterwork, but it is nowhere near perfect. Not even close. Not even by a long shot. I don't have any of the stats I would like to have greater affixed, and I definitely didn't land the masterworks that I wanted. So I think that this thing could truly ramp even harder, but it is an absolute delight to play. Now, why is it called the PoisonBurn SpiritBorn? Because we're making use of the old Frostburn gloves that I personally never even really touched in this game. However, very good on the SpiritBorn, and we'll get into why. You'd be like, well, you're playing a poison build, why are you using elemental gloves? We'll feed you, baby birds. Hang in there. So before we sort of get into the skill tree, we want to sort of give a quick overview. What's the tech, right? What are we abusing here? One, obviously, is the Noxious Resonance key passive node for the SpiritBorn, which says your critical strikes cause your poisoning on the enemy to burst, dealing 100% of the poison instantly to them and 20% of that damage to its surrounding enemies before removing the poison from the primary target. And this damage is increased by 30% of your critical strike damage bonus. So critical strike being full crit as a poison build is actually really, really good here. Now, normally, of course, poisons cannot crit. So scaling things like crit damage bonus on a poison build or a damage over time build is typically terrible. However, because of Noxious Resonance, we gain a lot of value from doing that. And we'll get into more of that. So essentially, we are, in fact, a traditional poison build. We're going to use pretty much all poison abilities, and any ability that's not a poison ability here will either be an ultimate or something we kind of just cast on demand. So in the gameplay above, you're going to see us just ramping these pestilent swarms. We're going to be choosing aspects that sort of support spawning as many of these swarms as we possibly can, as well as picking up runes that help us get more swarms. And the reason that's so good is because we're using a glyph called Consumption, which says you deal 2% increased damage for each active pestilent swarm or touch of death swarm. We're not using touch of death in this setup, so it's all pestilent swarms. So every single one of those little rotating swarms is increasing our damage by 2%. And that's 2% multiplicative and flat damage. It is not just poison damage, it is all damage. And when I say all damage, I truly mean all damage. That's your Mercenaries damage. That's any sort of proc that you do damage. Literally any type of damage that your character can possibly do, you can possibly think of, is being affected by the amount of pestilent swarms you have out. So of course, naturally, our goal is to get as many of these swarms out as possible to get flat damage multipliers for everything that we do. We're also going to be permanently shielded through the use of temerity and healing effects that we use. And we're going to be spamming all our skills like crazy because we're using the Jacinth Shell, which drains 10% of our life per second to reduce all of our active cooldowns by 3 seconds per second. But where the build really starts to get interesting is we're using the Frostburns. That's right. That is why it is called the PoisonBurn. You might be thinking, Fluff, that's an elemental pair of gloves. What are you doing? This is a poison build. Again, like we said, those swarms affect all your damage. So these proc numbers are affected by the amount of swarms that you have out. But more importantly, Frostburn gives a flat fire and damage cold additive damage bonus. And the reason that's so good is because we are using the Convergence Legendary Paragon board. You'll do bonus damage equal to 20% of your 2 highest total damage bonuses combined, up to 30% total. So we get a flat, just from the gloves alone, a 355% additive damage bonus, which means from this node alone, we're getting a 100% damage multiplier. And when we get into the Paragon section, we'll explain exactly why we chose that node, because you might be thinking on paper there's other runes or glyphs or Paragon boards that look better, but I promise you, they're not. All right, so starting out with the skill tree, as with any build I ever make, basically, I hate basic skills. I never want to run them. I never want them on my bar. Generators are a total waste of time. So we're going to put 2 points into literally anything you want, because we're never, ever going to use it. We're never going to put a basic skill on our bar. And 2 points unlocks the core part of the tree. And in the core part of the tree, we're focusing on Stinger. Stinger strikes a small area, dealing poison damage, and applies 50% of that base damage as poisoning over 6 seconds to all enemies hit. And additionally, we're using the Rampant Stinger, which says Stinger does 40% increased damage if it hits a single enemy instead of echoing to all surrounding enemies, and now draws from each enemy hit to deal more damage to the primary target. So that again is a 40% damage multiplier plus 10% times however many mobs are around you. So density is super, super nice here. And of course, that is as poison damage, which is super important for that key passive that we were talking about earlier, where we get that poison damage to crit. We're going to put 1 point into Vigorous. Casting a core skill increases all vigor generation by 5% for 3 seconds. This is actually really, really good. And if you're struggling for vigor generation, this might be worth investing more points into. But more importantly, we're trying to get balanced exertion. Your core skills cost 9% more vigor, but deal 15% increased damage. So very much like Imperfectly Balanced from the Necromancer. It costs more, but it does more damage. And resource will really not be an issue here between our 2 rings, and we'll get to more of that in our gearing section. Moving on to what they call the focus part of the tree. We're going to put 1 point into Toxic Skin. Now, Toxic Skin has both a passive and active effect. The passive effect we really don't care about here. It says enemies that attack us are basically going to get poisoned. However, the amount of CC we have in this setup is absolutely insane. We're freezing enemies. We're fearing enemies with pretty much 100% uptime. We're knocking down enemies like all the time. And all these things sort of add up to give us damage multipliers. We'll sort of get into that later. But the idea is we're really never going to get hit. There's going to be a point, the higher pit levels that you push, that yes, things will start to get CC immune. But for the most part, when you're just farming, nothing's ever going to hit you. Now, the active effect is what we're interested in here. Your toxins overflow, applying poison trail, making you unhindered for 5 seconds. Unhindered, insanely good here. We're going to have 100% uptime on this Toxic Skin, and we'll talk about why. But also importantly here is measured Toxic Skin. While Toxic Skin is active, you deal an additional 15% poison damage as critical strikes to nearby vulnerable enemies, poisoned enemies. Every second, everything's going to be vulnerable and poisoned around us. So this is just extra damage. But the most important thing about this Toxic Skin here is it gives us unhindered for its duration. Why is unhindered so good? Well, because of this part of the tree. So we're going to put all points we possibly can into a passive called Unrestrained Power. You deal 32% increased damage while unhindered or unstoppable. And again, you see the synergy here because we're always, literally always going to be unhindered as long as you remember to click that button once every 5 seconds. And to get there, we need to pick up 1 point into Mirage. You gain 20% increased dodge chance during evade, which is what? 20% dodge chance during evade. It's such a weird passive. But you also gain 5% critical strike chance for 3 seconds. Crit is good in this setup, but I wouldn't rely on this 5% crit chance. Now, with Focal Point, you get bonuses for the type of weapon you are wearing. So this actually does matter here. I'm going to recommend you guys use a glaive, because a glaive will give you 5% bonus lucky hit chance per point. Now, we're only using 1 point, so it's like it's 5% lucky hit. If you had a different weapon type, it's not the end of the world, but like if you're really min-maxing this thing, get yourself a glaive. It's the best weapon for this setup. And then 3 points into Apex, you deal 9% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Double this bonus versus elites. So 18% damage multiplier versus elites. Again, everything's going to be vulnerable 100% of the time. And then probably one of the most important pieces of this whole puzzle is an ability called Ravager. Ravager also has an active and passive. The passive, our minimum ferocity is increased by 2. This does not matter at all in this setup, and we'll talk about why. More importantly, the active effect unleashes a savage roar, causing enemies You attack to get additional damage per strike. This is fire damage. And again, we are scaling a bit of fire damage because of our Frostburn gloves. So this isn't a slouch as far as damage is concerned. And this does crit as well. So we're getting crit damage bonus. So it really is no slouch on damage. So every single time we're hitting with our Stinger, we're proccing this Ravager. We're also going to pick up Enhanced Ravager. Ravager duration is extended by 2 seconds per kill. This bonus is reduced by 0.25 each kill to a minimum of 0.25 seconds. Now, this thing, you'll notice the duration is insane. Like, you're going to pop this probably once every like 20 seconds, 20, 30 seconds, because you're going to get so many kills, especially with how fast you're moving. So this thing will keep itself up, which is really great when we talk about the gearing section, because basically you want things off cooldown, because having things on cooldown will actually drain your life and potentially kill you. So you don't want to be spamming this thing. You only want to be looking at the bar. When you cast it, it'll have like a green bar above it that shows you its duration. And then most importantly, while Ravager is active, your core skills instantly dash to your target and all vigor generations increase by 30%. So this is insane. This one passive is actually insane. So while we have Ravager active, anytime we cast Stinger and we have a target, we're going to teleport to them and slam one with a Stinger. And not only that, we're going to get 30% vigor generation while we do it. Ravagers is just an insane skill. Moving on down to the defensive part of the tree, we're put 1 point into Armored Hide. Again, Armored Hide has a passive and active effect. Our passive is gain 1 resolve every 5 seconds. So resolve is a mechanic specific to the Spiritborn. Basically, resolve increases your damage reduction by 20% while it's active. Taking direct damage consumes a stack. You can hold up to 8 stacks of resolve. So once every 5 seconds, we're going to get 1 stack of resolve. And now you might say, Fluff, that's terrible. We're never going to have it because you are getting hit sometimes. So resolve will fall off. However, we're going to pick up Enhanced Armored Hide. Activating Armored Hide grants you maximum resolve. So it instantly gives us our 8 stacks and increases your thorns, which we don't care about. We don't care about thorns at all. But while also it's active, you gain Unstoppable for its duration. Its base duration is 3 seconds. Now, again, because of our gear, we're using Jack in this Shell, and we'll explain what that does when we get to the gearing section. This thing will have 100% uptime if we want it to, but we don't want it to. Do not spam this skill. Armor Hide only has 2 purposes in this whole build. One is you want to cast it immediately when you enter an area. Like if you enter a pit, you want to cast it right at the start of the dungeon because it'll give you your full 8 stacks of resolve immediately. And then after that, you're never going to cast it again unless you get CC'd. This is your get out of jail free card. It's kind of like Blood Mist on the Necromancer, but with way shorter duration. So if you find yourself frozen or you think you're about to take some damage, you can pop Armored Hide and you'll get a 100% chance to block for 3 seconds on top of becoming unstoppable for 2 seconds. Unstoppable makes you basically immune to crowd control and parrying effects. Another super essential part of the build is an ability called Scourge. Scourge calls forth a wave of insects that bite enemies, fearing and slowing them by 50% for 3 seconds while applying X% poison damage over 6 seconds. So we're going to put all 5 points into this because this is a primary source of damage for this setup. We're also picking up Enhanced Scourge. Each time an enemy is hit with Scourge, you gain increased crowd controlled enemies for 6 seconds up to 50. This is a multiplier. And you'll see we're literally going to be spamming this ability. 1, off cooldown because it's super important. But 2, we're actually going to get bonus spams of it. And we'll show you guys why in a minute. But keeping up this 50% damage multiplier is absolutely insane. And it's actually really, really easy to do in this setup. We're also going to be using Reinforced Scourge. Casting Scourge grants you 60% of your maximum vigor. This basically lets us spam Stinger without worry whatsoever of running out of resource. Without this ability, you really sort of struggle to maintain resource on single target. Every single one time those little swarms hit something, you get 1 vigor, but when there's only 1 target, that doesn't equate to a lot of resource. This really tops off our resource versus single target, which is fantastic. And again, we're spamming this ability, so we're always going to have that. We'll put 1 point into Anti-Venom. You gain 50% increased poison resistance, and your maximum poison resistance is increased by 3. Only 1 point into that, even though it's quite good. We just don't need that maximum poison resistance. And then 3 points into Nourishment. Healing is increased by 20%. And whenever you heal, your poisoning damage is increased by 9% for 3 seconds. So this is going to have 100% uptime. And healing effects are super great because, again, we are using Temerity. And we'll talk about Temerity in a minute. Moving on down to what is called the Potency section of the tree. We're not picking up any skills here. We're putting 3 points into Ravenous. Your Centipede skills, which again is our poison skills, deal 7.5 increased damage, double this bonus versus healthy enemies. So we get 50% increased damage versus healthy enemies. We'll also put 3 points into Oppressive. Your Centipede skills deal 12% increased damage to crowd-controlled enemies and gain 30% increased crowd control duration. We don't really care about that crowd control duration, but 12% damage multiplier versus CC, and everything's going to be CC'd basically 100% of the time here until they become CC immune. A fantastic passive here, maybe the best passive that the SpiritBorn has to offer, is called Potent. Hitting enemies with Jaguar skill increases the damage they take from you by 0.3 up to 30%. So we're going to have flat 30% damage multiplier because Ravager is popping off nonstop. Again, that Ravager duration gets extended every single time you kill something. So it's going to be up 100% of the time and proccing this potent effect, giving us a 30% damage multiplier, which is just nutty. We're going to put 1 point into Resilient. Casting a Gorilla skill grants 5% increased maximum life. This is also a really good passive. We just don't have enough points to fully max it. And again, because of our Spirit Hall, all of our skills are technically considered Gorilla skills. And we're going to put 2 points into Dominant. This is a really good passive. However, we are just out of points to spec into. So this would be 15% at maximum, but 10% is good enough. But you deal 10% increased damage to knock down enemies, and their first hits have a 5% chance to execute non-bosses. This actually fires off more than you would think, which is really cool. And you don't need any points basically invested to get that full 5% execution chance. The reason I decided to sacrifice 1 point from this is because it's not 100% uptime versus some of the other passives we're going to show you. We only have a 30% chance through the Paragon board to knock down vulnerable enemies, which actually pops off quite a bit. And we're also using a Mercenary that does knock down, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Mercenary section. So this does go off quite a bit. It's just not 100% uptime. But again, 10% damage multiplier. Moving down into arguably the most important section for any SpiritBorn is going to be the ultimates. Ultimates are crazy good. Now, I will say all of these are good. Now, I should caveat that. All of these have great functionality. Are they good on their own? No, they don't do that much damage. However, they do scale because of all the swarms we do. The damage scales with how many swarms we have out. But honestly, they all have use. The Devour, is more poison damage. It can be really nice. Versus single targets, especially ones that remain still. Devour is such a cool ultimate. The Gorilla is really, really great as well because you pop him down, you're basically super tanky. This can be really, really great if maybe you're fighting content that's a little over your level. I popped this on a few times when I was leveling. The Seeker is really, really great for keeping up resolution. We'll talk about it in just a second. But for me, honestly, it's the Jaguar. Jaguar is just insane. It's super fun to use. It has great synergy with the build, but let's talk about what it does. So you bound across the battlefield. You'll see in the gameplay, like I just hop and it's like things get smashed like all the way across the screen. You bound across the battlefield. So it's a mobility skill, dealing blank damage and then rapidly slashing enemies in the area. So you'll see a big circle, a fire circle for 7 strikes. But more importantly, what sort of makes the Jaguar so cool, not only because it's a mobility skill, but gives us Harmonious Hunter. The Hunter fills your ferocity. And again, ferocity is also a unique mechanic to the SpiritBorn. Every stack of ferocity gives us 5% attack speed and can stack up to 4 times on its own. But because we are using the secondary Spirit Hall, that is the Ferocity Jaguar, we get our maximum ferocity goes up by 1. So we're at 5 max ferocity. And we gain 1 stack of ferocity whenever we kill an enemy or damage a boss. So we're going to have permanent uptime in these stacks of ferocity. But what we also get is 4 additional stacks. So we get 9 stacks temporarily for 8 seconds, and you get 100% damage multiplier to injured enemies. So while they're at 35%, and this isn't just for the hunter, right? This is for you. So all the damage you're doing, all the poison damage you're doing is doing 100% damage multiplier for injured enemies. So anything that's under 35% life, you have this crazy 100x multiplier against. And then most importantly, what we really love is the Exalted Hunter. Killing an enemy while the hunter is active has a 40% chance to instantly reset its cooldown. This chance is half after each consecutive reset. So every single time you kill something, it'll reset the hunter, and then basically every consecutively time that you do it, the chance goes down. But our cooldown reduction is absolutely insane. We're not speccing any cooldown reduction because of the chest piece that we're using, and we'll get into that in a second. So the uptime of the hunter is insane, and the mobility of the hunter is insane. I really, really, really like the hunter, but all of them are quite good. We're using Resolution. Casting an ultimate skill grants 15% increased damage to elites for 3 seconds. Double this if you're only fighting one enemy. So it's 30% damage multiplier versus bosses for 3 seconds. This is great when you're clearing a pit or a rift or whatever you're doing, because you do have pretty good uptime on the hunter. I think the Seeker definitely has a slightly better uptime, but the hunter is just it's just so much more fun to use. 1 point in spiritual attunement just so we can reach supremacy. Any enemy you kill while the ultimate is active grants a stack of supremacy, increasing your damage by 3% up to 30%. When the ultimate skill ends, you gain 5% to supremacy, but you begin to lose 1 every second. So potentially get up a 30% damage multiplier, losing 3% every second when your ultimate ends. This is going to have pretty good uptime. It's just more damage. It's fantastic. 1 point to sustenance, but only to reach intricacy. Upon casting an ultimate skill, the last different potency, defensive, or focus skill you cast prior to its reset can be cast again for free up to 3 times. And you're going to see we use this solely on spamming Scourge. So all you got to do before you cast the Hunter is make sure Scourge was the last ability you cast. Now this will take some getting used to. The worst thing you do is use the intricacy and cast something like Armored Hide, Toxic Skin, Ravager. All would be terrible to cast before you cast the Hunter, because the Hunter will give you 3 free casts of Scourge, which is insane amounts of damage, insane amounts of CC uptime, really easy to get that 50% damage multiplier. So 100% of the time you want to be casting Scourge before you cast Hunter, and it's going to be up quite a bit. You're going to mess up sometimes, and that's okay, but do try to put that 2 together, because if you don't, you've wasted your ultimate cooldown. And all the other abilities we have on our bar are really bad to pair with this intricacy node. And then lastly, we already talked about at the start of the video, but Noxious Resonance. Your critical strikes cause your poisoning damage on the enemy to burst, dealing 100% of that damage to them and 20% to its surrounding enemies before removing the poison. So basically when we crit, all the poison damage we have on them, either through Scourge or through Stinger or whatever poisoning effect we're going to have, it's going to burst. And it's going to 100% of that burst to the target plus 20% to your surrounding enemies. So this thing fires off it's kind of like exploding palm, but poison. And of course, this damage is increased by 30% multiplier of your critical strike damage. So again, critical strike damage bonus is going to be super important to try to spec into. And we'll do that using the Paragon board and tempers. Now for Spirit Hall, again, Spirit Hall is specific to the Spiritborn. We're using the primary spirit of the gorilla. Again, your primary spirit hall choice makes all your skills have that tag, which is actually pretty cool. So we're going to be choosing the gorilla. Casting gorilla skills deals 100% of your thorns damage, which we don't care about. We're not scaling thorns whatsoever. But more importantly, grants a barrier for 5% of your maximum life, up to 30% for 3 seconds. So basically with all the attack speed, which we're going to be at our attack speed cap pretty easily actually in this build, we're going to be getting that full barrier with 100% uptime, and our barrier is just insane. And you guys can see in the gameplay. Our secondary hull choice is going to be the Jaguar, getting that maximum ferocity to +1. So that gets us 25% attack speed, and then we get another 4 stacks from using the Jaguar ultimate. So it gets 9 stacks of ferocity. We'll get 45% attack speed without even trying. It's not even like something we have to spec for or gear for. You just get 45% attack speed. You can get even more, and we actually do early on. You get 5 more stacks of ferocity on like a pair of boots, and that's what I use pretty much through the whole game until we have better gear. But yeah, ferocity, GG. Moving on to the gear section. Now again, this gear is not min-maxed. I'm going to, again, click the link down below. I'll have the gear in that video. Now, this is the gear I'm using. Like I said, a lot of room for improvement here. We're actually pretty starved on PTR for some reason for iron chunks and raw hide. There was like a bug. So it was really hard to masterwork really anything at all. So let alone try to land the masterworks that I wanted to. So it's really just a matter of just trying to get things up to level 12. And that took a lot of time, believe me. So again, this gear is not very good. We are using 2 mythic uniques, but I will include down below, there will be 2 different gear sets that we're going to have. First up, we're using the new mythic unique helmet called Heir of Perdition. This thing is absolutely perfect for this build because we love crit, we love lucky, we love movement speed, and we definitely love ranks the core skills. But it also gives us a 60% damage multiplier on a helmet slot, which is just insane. So this helmet is just crazy good. We want to land on 100% crit because again, our key passive gives us more damage to poison for landing those crits. Ideally here, you would want to GA the core skills, which I was lucky enough to do with my 1 drop on PTR. I would love to get that fully masterwork to +7 core skills, but that's pretty darn good as it is. Inside of the helmet slot, I personally like to cast more swarms. So we're setting ourselves up to cast more swarms with runes. And again, the gameplay above and what's currently live on the canopy version or the pre-release version of Diablo 4, these pestilent swarms do not do near as much damage as they will do when this goes live. I think they just got a damage bonus from like 25% to like 300%. So they'll be doing way more damage. But again, it's not necessarily about the damage the pestilent swarms are doing. They do really good damage. It's more about the sheer amount of quantity of these swarms that we want to have out at one time. So we've set ourselves up in a way that lets us have the most swarms we possibly can have as fast as we possibly can spawn them out. So inside of our helmet, we're using the Yule and What runes. The Yule rune basically makes it so every single time we cast an ability with the cooldown, we get 50 offering. And again, we're spamming cooldowns like crazy here, so that pops off like nuts. And then with that, we're combining it with the What rune, which is invoke the Necromancer's Horde Decrepify, slowing enemies, reducing their damage, and letting you execute them. Now, for you guys that don't play Necro, it is basically when they're below 10% life, they're instantly killed unless it's a boss. So this thing pops off like crazy. Really, really good synergy with this build. On top of straight up giving you a 20% DR, which is just nuts. But the reason it's so good is we're combining that with the runes on our chest, which are Zoltal. Basically, every single time we invoke a skill from another class, which is the Necromancer's Aberrant Decrepify, which has a super cheap cost of 100. So it'll be popping off like crazy. But every single time we invoke that curse, we're basically getting a pestilent swarm. Now it overflows. So every time we get the invocation of the curse, we get 150 offering, and the skill only requires 100 offerings. So we get actually multiple pestilent swarms every single time this triggers. And again, pestilent swarms are insane because we get 2% damage multiplier per swarm that's out. We are using the Jacinth Shell chest piece, arguably probably the single most important piece of gear in this whole setup, which just says anytime we spend vigor, which is every single time we cast Stinger, which again, we're spamming here with 100% attack speed bonus. So we're spamming it doubly fast. You heal for 1 to 10% life, which is a really insane amount of healing on top of the fact that this thing rolls life on hit. But most importantly, every second, your active cooldowns each drain 10% max life from you to reduce the durations by 3 seconds. So you'll notice every single time we cast one of our abilities, it comes back super quick because every second, 3 seconds is being shaved off and 10% of our life is being shaved off. Now that might sound like a ton of life to lose per second, and it is, don't get me wrong. The amount of healing we're doing in this setup is absolutely insane. And we're combining it with Temerity. Now these pants have been in the game for a while. I personally never used them on anything, but honestly, Temerity plus Jacinth Shell as like peas and carrots might be the best 2-item combination I've ever seen. This is basically the only defensive piece of gear we're even running in this whole setup because it's that good with Jacinth Shell. But Temerity says, effects that heal you beyond 100% of your life grant you a barrier up to 100% of your maximum life that lasts for 8 seconds. And you can drink a potion while at max life to get that barrier up. So if you lose the barrier, you can dash out, you can spam some potions and get your barrier maxed to full instantly. Now on the Jacinth Shell, if I had my choice, I would probably GA either the max life or the life on hit. Both of those have really good value. Damage reduction while injured. It sounds cool on paper because, hey, if I had low life, which, you know, this thing's draining your life, that's great. But honestly, it doesn't, your life doesn't really ever dip that much. It pretty much stays at full unless you get one shot. And again, this build doesn't really get one shot. The only time I get one shot in PTR were due to some barrier bugs. This build is pretty insane as far as tankiness is concerned. As long as you're hitting fast enough and dealing enough life per hit and not standing in some like crazy amount of damage, you'll never die. But that's the thing here too. Quick caveat. You always need to be hitting something. You always need to be hitting something, or at least spending your vigor. Because if the moment you stop hitting stuff, the moment you're struggling to find a target, the moment you're not attacking, your health pool is going to go down like crazy and you're going to get hurt. You might even die. So just be aware of that. Like, keep attacking. Keep the momentum going. Don't stop. Talk about the Temerity pants real quick. Another reason these are so good because they have that lucky hit. You can 50% chance to heal for X amount of life. You get damage reduction while you're healthy, which is really, really good. You also get healing received, which is also really, really good. And then a flat percentage to your max life pool. These pants are insane stats for this setup. If I could pick what to GA here, I do like healing received. I do like damage reduction while healthy. Max life percentage is really good, but we're not overpower. So like, yes, life pool is super nice for defensive purposes, but it's not like we're scaling our life pool at all for more damage. So yeah, either healing received or damage reduction while healthy. Probably damage reduction while healthy. And again, you want to get that as close to 100% as you possibly can. The best pair I found here on this test version was a 97%. And then frost burns, like we said, who knew, right? So again, we're using frost burns because of that convergence Paragon board, and we'll talk about the whole Paragon board in a minute. But because of that flat additive to 2 damage bonus types, we get a huge damage multiplier. So these gloves are insane. It has a base lucky hit chance. Lucky hit chance is really, really good in this setup because we're using the aspect, because we are using the infestation aspect. We'll get to that in just a second. So we're scaling lucky hit. Get some really massive lucky hit pieces here between Air Perdition and Ring of Star of the Skies. Plus we're scaling lucky hit anywhere else we can get it. But every single time we lucky hit, we deal X amount of fire damage, X amount of cold damage. And again, these hits actually hit pretty freaking hard because the amount of swarms we have going out that are increasing our flat damage. Plus these procs, they crit. Same, we are scaling crit damage bonus. So these actually are no slouch. These are hitting pretty hard. But most importantly, these gloves are on because of that added damage. Convergence, getting basically 100% damage multiplier if you land a GA on these. The additive fire and cold damage would absolutely be the best thing to GA and masterwork, because at full GA and masterwork, you get this bad boy up to 491 fire and cold damage, which means you can get 147% damage multiplier just from one slot and one Paragon board, which is just nutty. Love it. I actually love it. So you get those 2 procs, you get increased attack speed. And again, with just these gloves and the Ring of Star of the Skies and some crit on your necklace, you're basically going to be sitting at 100% crit chance if you like fully masterwork everything. Being at max crit is going to be super duper important. And we also get a lucky chance to freeze. So this effect is up quite a bit because that lucky hit is a up to 60% chance to freeze enemies for 3 seconds. So you're going to see in the gameplay, everything's frozen most of the time. For the pants, we didn't talk about sockets, just grand dexterity. You could opt for barrier generation here as an amethyst gem. It does give you barrier generation if you pick an amethyst. However, I found that really our barrier has perfect uptime, so getting just more dexterity seemed like a good choice here. Dexterity is more damage multiplier. It did receive a nerf recently, so it's definitely not as much as it used to be, but it's still no slouch. As far as the boots are concerned, this is actually also one of the most important pieces you get that's non-unique, and it is super important because it is non-unique. But this is where we had to sort of make up all our defenses. Because we're using so many uniques, especially in our armor slots, we basically have no armor whatsoever, on top of really not having the best all res. So super important, armor and all res, gotta have those 2 stats 100% on the boots. Outside of that, max life, early game vigor per second can be nice instead of max life, but definitely once you get the Ring of Royal Grandeur or your cooldown's good enough to spam Scourge, you do not need vigor per second. As far as tempers are concerned, I actually don't love my tempers here, but I'm out, and again, my gear's not the best. If I could pick anything here, I would pick boots can actually roll a stinger size. And again, stinger size would be beneficial because that secondary effect there where it draws from enemies. I think that would be the play. And then you could either do movement speed, or you get to a point on the SpiritBorn where just movement speed so much. You could do like evade cooldown reduction. That would actually be a decent choice. As far as the aspect, we love aspect of apprehension here, which says once an enemy is slowed or by at least 80%, they also become feared for 3 seconds. We don't care about that part of it, but it says you deal up to 40% increased damage to feared enemies. And again, because we're spamming Scourge, we're literally spamming Scourge, everything's going to be feared all the time. So we're going to get a flat damage multiplier 40% on boots. For a weapon, again, we want that glaive base type because of that passive and the skill tree. The glaive does have one of the better effects, 63% increased damage to elites. As far as rolls are concerned, dexterity, max life, damage over time here is good because it can roll higher than crit damage, but I actually might opt for more crit damage over time here, because again, crit damage affects everything that we do, whereas damage over time only affects the poisons. As far as tempers, definitely crit strike damage and a chance for Stinger to do an extra hit. Now, if the Stinger can hit twice, because of the imprint here, the Pestilence imprint, it says Stinger spawns a Pestilence swarm at its target location, which deals 130% of Stinger's base damage per hit. And it also makes the swarms last 100% longer and spiral outwards. That's huge. That's super duper important for this setup. So being able to spawn 2 Stingers is doubly good, not only for Stinger hitting twice because it actually does decent damage, but 2, spawning 2 swarms at once is super OP. I think all said and done, you could get that chance to Stinger, if you fully masterwork that, up to 77%. That would be ideal. And throw in 2 crit strike damage gems inside of that bad boy to top it all off. Moving on to the amulet. A lot of good things you can roll on the amulet, but the really, really important thing here, and something you're probably not going to see a whole heck of a lot of in Diablo 4, is an armor roll on your amulet. This is literally the only way this setup can achieve the armor cap, is by rolling an armor roll on your necklace. Other stats important on the necklace here are going to be getting a crit roll, preferably a GA crit roll. Percent dex is good, but again, it's not as good as it used to be. So I'd actually say getting something like potency would be insane, because potency, if you get that fully GA'd on a necklace, you can get +7 to potent, and that gives you a 70% more damage, which is just insane. Potent is a really good passive to get on an amulet. As far as tempers, again, this item's brick, this is PTR. That's not what I would roll. I would love to roll critical strike damage for the offensive, and then a cooldown reduction for the hunter. As far as the second one is, you can get up to 29% hunter cooldown reduction, which would be super juicy for those times that the secondary effect Exalted Hunter does not proc for you. Most importantly, on the necklace, we have the infestation aspect, which says centipede skills have a 35% chance to spawn a pestilent swarm from the target, which deals a flat poison damage amount. But also super important, pestilent swarms now deal 100% of their base damage as poisoning damage over 6 seconds. So some of your swarms are going to be from this lucky hit, and they don't hit that hard. But again, more swarms is good, because more swarms means more damage, 2% per swarm. But this means the Stinger swarms, which deal up to 150% of the base damage of Stinger, last 100% longer, and they also deal 100% of their base damage as poisoning over 6 seconds. But furthermore, we're using what's called the Ring of Writhing Moon. And this effect says pestilent swarms spawn from you every 10 seconds, which is a terrible effect. But more importantly, the second part, your pestilent swarms now orbit around you and generate 1 vigor per enemy hit. So each one of those swarms in a big AoE, you're going to be sitting at pretty much max resource without hesitation. But more importantly, they orbit around you, so you're just able to control them like way better. But on top of that, Ring of the Writhing Moon has really good stats for us. It's critical strike chance, which is super important. It has super high rolls of lightning and poison resistance, which we'll talk about min-maxing the character in just a second. Also, a super important roll for this build is lucky hit chance to make enemies vulnerable. Now, I happen to hit this twice on a masterwork, which is terrible, but you can get this bad boy up to 100% chance. I think with just a GA alone, it gets up to 92%. So that's probably good enough. I think 68% chance is good enough with how often you're hitting this build. I don't think you need to GA that whatsoever. Finally, you get points to Unrestrained Power, which is where I would definitely recommend you spend your juice on, because Unrestrained Power per point gives 4% damage while unhindered or unstoppable. And again, that has 100% uptime because of Toxic Skin. We are permanently unhindered. So definitely fully GA and masterwork that. You can get that bad boy up to +8. That's going to be huge for your damage. Next up, the classic in Diablo 4, Ring of Starless Skies. This gives 25% all res, which is super GG for any build to hit that all res cap, which we easily do. But more importantly, it has the most insane stats ever for this build. It's got attack speed, crit strike chance, fantastic, lucky hit chance, amazing, and then core skills. Again, more Stinger ranks, which is GG. If I could GA masterwork anything, it would definitely be the core skills, more base damage for Stinger. As far as gems, you can see here, we're using a perfect ruby, we're using a perfect sapphire, and a perfect amethyst to get shadow, cold, and fire, which just caps us enough with our Paragon board to hit our max res. This is not showing in town, but we are capped on poison res. So between one all res roll on the boots, these 3 specific gems, and the Paragon board, we're going to be at all res cap in World Tier 4, aka Torment 4. No problem. And of course, Starless Guys gives us a 50% damage multiplier to everything we do. Moving on to Paragon, I will say that this is not perfectly min-maxed. This is not the Paragon board up to date on max roll. I'm hoping that once the embargo goes live, we'll be able to fully min-max this perfectly. This is a general setup, but I will absolutely spend a ton of time and have this min-max perfectly once the max roll website gets up to date and the embargo lifts. I'm sure it'll be very shortly after that. But here are my general thoughts on how to sort of traverse through this board. So first up, board I'd recommend would be Exploit until you get your Ring Writhing Moon lucky hit chance pretty significant or proc it enough to think that you don't need the Exploit anymore. Because again, the Exploit will make everything instantly vulnerable the first time you hit them. So it's a really good starter glyph, but once you're sort of hitting that vulnerable more frequently and more reliably, definitely switch to the Headhunter, because the Headhunter gives you a 10% damage multiplier versus elites and then another 5% at max level, on top of giving you more additive dexterity, which dexterity is a skill multiplier. Moving on, we really like the Vicious Shield node. Of course, we are 100% of the time going to have 100% of our life as barrier. It doesn't matter what the quantity of our life pool is. It's just a percentage here. So while we have our full life pool at barrier, which does happen quite a bit, we get a 33.3% damage multiplier. There's some super important life and armor rolls here on the left, headed into the consumption. And again, we talked about this earlier, but consumption glyph is super important. You get 2% increased damage multiplier for each swarm that is active. The idea is pumping out these swarms as fast as humanly possible. Now you also get a pretty juicy additive here with the Pestilent Swarm damage. So picking out some of those glyphs is no slouch. I wouldn't do this early on, but sort of later when you're in your 200 plus Paragon. And then you get an additional 5% poison damage once you get that glyph to legendary. There's some super important resistance nodes here on the right, where we go into the revealing board. Revealing's nice because again, we're scaling lucky and everything's going to be vulnerable, so we're going to be knocking stuff down a lot. But more importantly, you get 30% increased damage to crowd controlled enemies. While this doesn't help us on bosses, it does help us when we stagger them. We stagger them pretty quick because we do have a lot of CC effects here. But throughout the rest of the Rift, we get that 30% damage multiplier, plus that damage multiplier we get from being a gorilla primary hall. On this board, we like Bane. Bane has the additional bonus of getting a 15% chance to deal double the amount of damage of the duration for poisons. This is actually really good because it's calculated at the start of the dot. So that key passive we have that deals the crit damage of the poison, that's factored in. So this is quite good. Bane is GG. On top of that, it gives us increased poison damage for every point we spend in the radius, and then a 5% additional poison damage bonus at level 46. And Bane is pretty important early on before you get your hands on Frostburn, because it'll be the only way you can scale Convergence. But I like going through the middle here. There's some attack speed and poison resistance. This is super vital for getting our poison res cap, some easy armor and max life nodes down here as well. Moving on to the left side here, we like the sapping board. When you cast 3 gorilla, jaguar, eagle, or centipede skills with the same spirit in a row, restore 15% of your vigor and deal 30% increased damage for 5 seconds. This is basically going to be up 100% of the time because we're spamming centipede skills left and right. I like coming in for the all res and max life. It's super vital for getting yourself capped. This board has a lot of juice as far as all res is concerned. You can come through the middle and pick up even more all res nodes and armor nodes here. And then on this board, I really like Spirit Glyph. Spirit Glyph gets insane amounts of crit damage. There's a load of dexterity nodes here to be had. But the Spirit board in general gives I'm pretty sure it's like 8% damage multiplier to elites on the legendary bonus. But more importantly, you get a 15% damage multiplier on the additional bonus. Plus you get loads of additive crit damage for the radius. So Spirit is probably the best glyph the Spiritborn has to offer. And then lastly, but not least, is Convergence. So we've talked about sort of time and time again in this video. This thing gives us a crazy damage multiplier. I love the Convergence board because it is really, really good. We peek into the convergence board and we just pick up the canny rune, which gives us increased non-physical damage for every point in the radius. We're not picking up a ton of points in the radius. This does increase everything, but what I've learned from talking with one of the developers, that even though this non-physical damage does increase your cold damage, it does increase your fire damage, it doesn't, non-physical damage additives do not scale your convergence. So really getting more value out of non-physical damage, it's just a flat additive at that point, so it's not very good to invest into. So we just peek in, get enough points to get that secondary bonus. Non-physical damage is increased by all the non-physical damage they take, and again, we're a poison build, so this is going to be 100% of the time, and it'll get a 5% damage multiplier at level 46. Coming up this left side, there's some max life, all res nodes, fantastic. Some more max life nodes here to be had. Pick up the convergence, go against to the top, get a little bit of non-physical attack speed just to cap our attack speed, but more importantly, all res and armor over here. So convergence is really, really a good board. I think convergence and probably sapping are two of the strongest boards with all the all res and armor you can get on those two. But again, please, like this is not the final form. Do not copy this to the T. As soon as the embargo lifts and Max Roll gets their shizzle up to date, I will have this board absolutely min-max, so do stay tuned to that written guide below. Now, for the first time ever, mercenary recommendations section of the video here. I really like Subo. Subo is not only good because he reveals a whole area, which can make Helltide farming super convenient, and also make finding juicy packs inside of a pit really convenient. But Subo gives some nice damage over time multipliers. So one, he gives Molotov, which slows, which is whatever, and does damage over time, whatever. That scales off of our damage, and again, we have fire damage, so it's actually not terrible. But more importantly, the Scorched Earth, the Molotov explosion causes enemies to take 30% increased damage over time from you for 30 seconds, or for 33 seconds, and that is a multiplier. And again, we are mostly a poison build, so that's quite good. And then if you move down the snipe here, he charges a piercing bolt once every 20 seconds. But if the snipe hits, then another Molotov will pop down. So more Molotovs, this is more damage over time, 30% multiplier. So yeah, I think Subo is the best, but right here is not too bad either, especially if you need either 15 all res or just a little bit more armor. He can provide that for you. It's pretty much the number one reason you pick him. Plus, if you find yourself dying a lot, he can save your life. His once every 30 seconds, he can negate some damage for you. It makes him really good defensively. For reinforcement, I really like Variana. She has an ability called Earthbreaker, which crushes the ground with her mace, leaving a tremor that deals massive physical damage and knocks enemies down repeatedly. And so I tie this to my hunter skill. So that means every single time I cast my hunter, the enemies will get knocked down. And again, we get that knockdown damage bonus that we have on our skill tree. So that is super juicy. Other thing can be good here is the Bloodthirst if you need the additional attack speed. But I think that she probably overall is the best reinforcement I've experienced so far. For damage rotation, I will say that if you're not really a fan of like really clicky builds, really fast-paced stuff, that you're probably not going to have the best time on this build. Yeah, well, like we touched on earlier, as soon as you enter a map, you want to hit your Armored Hide to make sure you get resolve stacks to maximum. That gives you a 20% damage reduction for every hit that hits you. After that, I like casting Ravager and then jumping in and spamming some stingers. And then make sure you cast Scourge and Toxic Skin off cooldown, just sitting there spamming your stingers. Now, when you see an elite pack, that's when you really have to sort of think just a little bit. It is very spammy, like I said, but you have to think just a little bit and make sure, like we said earlier, that Scourge is the last ability you cast before you cast your ultimate, because that makes it so Scourge can be spammed, which is 100% ideal. What can happen if you accidentally cast, say, Ravager, and then you cast your ultimate? Well, now Ravager's off cooldown, and that literally does just absolutely nothing for you. The same thing if you accidentally hit Toxic Skin before Hunter. Well, then now you can spam Toxic Skin, but again, that really does nothing for you whatsoever. So it's super duper important here to make sure that Scourge is the final ability you use before casting your ultimate, so you can spam that while you're spamming your stinger. It's really, really nice. Good combo. That's all there is to it, honestly. Save your ulti, or try to save your ulti for big groups. Try not to CC immune the elites, so only fight elite pack if you got a hunter up, but there should always be a hunter up. Like, it comes up that fast, especially if you're killing stuff, as a 40% chance to reset. And again, always make sure that Scourge was the last ability you cast before casting your ultimate. So you can get those free casts of Scourge, which gives you like tons of CC damage and tons of essence regen. It's nutty. But that's basically going to do it for the video, guys. This build, I got to say, is the most fun. It's almost like you're playing an entirely different game that's in the world of Diablo 4. It's like that fast paced. It's super fun. I've really enjoyed putting this together and making it. And I'm actually really excited to see what it can actually do, because again, my gear is not perfect. It's not top notch. It's okay, but it's nowhere near what it could be. But this thing is absolutely maybe best in slot for, you know, especially farming things like Helltide, farming Nightmare Dungeons, stuff, content that's meant to be farmed fast. This is just like unparalleled. If you guys didn't know, Blizzard is once again, like they did at launch, going to do their support a streamer program, which means I think you can gift 2 subs to get a mount, and you get 4 subs to get like a special armored mount. So just like they'd have a horse on the store, if you guys are interested in that mount, you can, you know, come into my stream. Only works in my stream, but you can come to my stream and give subs to me. It really, honestly, goes a long way, especially right now we're unemployed, chat. So obviously your donations and subscriptions on Twitch do help out a lot, but you know, obviously just coming and hanging out is more than enough. If you have any questions, do ask them in the comment section below. I do a pretty good job of keeping up to date with those, and let me know what you're hyped to play in the upcoming Season 6 Vessel of Hatred for Diablo 4. That's going to do it for the video, guys. As always, like, subscribe, and come over to Twitch. Ask your questions. We love you guys. Peace out.